Australia is at a crossroads. On the 31st of August 2025, a wave of anti-immigration protests will sweep through the country under the banner of the so-called March for Australia. Across Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth and Canberra, thousands are expected to gather, holding placards and chanting slogans that call for the country to take our country back and stop mass migration now. For some, it will be seen as a grassroots movement, fueled by frustration over housing, infrastructure, and the cost of living. For others, it will be a worrying sign of rising xenophobia, a flashpoint where public anger risks being hijacked by far-right groups. But behind the noise of the rallies, a far deeper question hangs in the air. Will these protests actually shape the future of Australia's immigration policy? And more specifically, will they influence the all-important migration planning levels that dictate how many people can call Australia home in the years to come? To answer that, we need to understand the stage on which these protests are unfolding. Australia has always been a nation of immigrants, from the post-war migration boom that transformed its workforce to the waves of skilled migrants and international students who fuel today's economy. Yet at the same time, immigration has often been a political lightning rod, blamed for crowding cities, straining public services, and driving up housing costs. Now, in 2025, with the housing crisis at record levels and cost of living pressures forcing families to the breaking point, immigration has once again moved to the center of national debate. The timing of the protests could not be more critical. Normally, by May, the government announces the migration planning levels for the next financial year. These levels decide how many visas will be issued across skilled, family, and humanitarian streams. But this year, unusually, the announcement has been delayed. And that delay speaks volumes. Why the hesitation? Officially, the government has pointed to ongoing reviews, shifting economic data, and the need to carefully balance skills shortages with social cohesion. Unofficially, it's clear they are walking on political quicksand. A leaked Treasury paper earlier this year revealed that internal models were considering sharp cuts to migration as a way to cool housing demand. Then came the tax bombshell leak, which exposed budgetary fears tied directly to population growth. Add to this the surge of public anger reflected in opinion polls, with many Australians ranking immigration as a key driver of housing unaffordability, and suddenly the stakes for the government could not be higher. Against this backdrop, the March for Australia protests threaten to turn simmering discontent into a full-blown political crisis. So, will the protest change the numbers? Will we see a radical reset of the migration program in the years ahead? To understand what might happen, let's first look at how protests and public opinion have historically shaped immigration policy in Australia. In the late 1990s, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party tapped into fears of high immigration and globalization, shifting mainstream debate even if their political power remained limited. During the global financial crisis, migration levels were cut sharply in response to unemployment fears. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, borders slammed shut, leading to one of the most dramatic reductions in migration in the country's history. Time and again, we see that when public pressure builds, governments act, sometimes drastically. Today's situation is even more volatile because the planning level for 2025 to 2026 still hangs in the balance. The government has promised around 185,000 places in the current program year, but what happens next is uncertain. Officials in Treasury and Home Affairs are still debating whether to maintain that figure, scale it down, or rebalance the intake away from family and humanitarian visas and toward highly skilled workers only. And now, with the protests looming, ministers are keenly aware that any announcement risks either fueling anger on the streets or sparking backlash from business sectors desperate for skilled labor. In short, they are cornered. The protests themselves are being framed as non-violent rallies concerned with housing and infrastructure. But lurking beneath are darker forces. Far-right groups, including the National Socialist Network, have openly promoted the marches on social media, calling for Australians to reclaim their nation. Their presence gives the protests a dangerous edge, making them not just a policy demonstration, but a battleground for national identity. This matters because politicians are hypersensitive to optics. If footage of neo-Nazi groups marching alongside ordinary Australians dominates the headlines, it will force the government to distance itself further from pro-immigration narratives, even if quietly it knows the economy needs migrants. The pressure to at least symbolically cut numbers could become overwhelming. But here is the paradox. Australia's economy is heavily reliant on migration. Skilled migrants are filling critical gaps in healthcare, construction, and technology. International students pump billions into the education sector. Regional communities depend on temporary visa holders to keep farms and small businesses alive. A sudden dramatic cut to planning levels could plunge industries into crisis, worsening the very economic problems that fuel public anger. That is why the government is trying to stall, delay, and buy time, hoping to ride out the protest wave without locking itself into a path that damages growth. The protests may not rewrite immigration policy overnight, but they create a political climate where every decision becomes more fraught, more scrutinized, and more likely to be framed through the lens of housing and cost of living. So what are the scenarios that could unfold? One possibility is that the protests fizzle out, dismissed as fringe events overshadowed by extremist imagery. If that happens, the government may quietly release planning levels closer to the usual figure, perhaps with modest adjustments and a strong emphasis on regional visas. Another possibility is that the protests ignite broader public anger, gaining enough momentum to dominate news cycles and polling. In that case, the government could announce a symbolic cut, perhaps reducing the intake by 20,000 to 30,000 places, while loudly framing it as a response to housing pressures. The third, more dramatic scenario is that the protests mark the beginning of a larger anti-immigration movement that reshapes the electoral landscape. If that occurs, especially heading into the next federal election, both major parties could adopt tougher stances, leading to sustained lower migration caps for years to come. Which outcome is most likely? The truth is that the delay in releasing next year's planning level suggests the government already fears public backlash. At the very least, we can expect the protests to be used as a barometer of public mood. If turnout is high and coverage widespread, the numbers are more likely to fall. If turnout is weak or dominated by extremist images, the government may feel emboldened to keep numbers steady. Either way, the protests add pressure to a system already at breaking point. Migration planning is not just about numbers, but about balance. A government under pressure might keep the overall cap high, but shift the composition. More visas could be pushed towards skilled migration, while family reunion visas are trimmed. Humanitarian visas, always a political flashpoint, could be quietly reduced. International student visas, already under new restrictions, may face further tightening. In other words, the protests may not slash the headline figure, but could still reshape who gets to come to Australia and under what conditions. For migrants and future applicants, the uncertainty is unsettling. Families waiting for reunion, skilled workers eyeing opportunities, and international students investing their futures in Australian degrees are all caught in a storm they cannot control. For them, the protests represent not just political theatre, but a potential turning point in their lives. Will the doors remain open, or will Australia once again turn inward under the pressure of public anger? The answer may come not in grand statements, but in subtle shifts, preparing the ground by framing migration policy around sustainability. Ministers speak of the need to balance growth with housing and infrastructure, language designed to signal responsiveness without committing to drastic cuts. But behind closed doors, bureaucrats are running the numbers, weighing economic needs against political survival. And every chant, every placard, every news headline from the protests feeds into that equation. As the sun sets on the 31st of August, the images broadcast across Australia will matter more than the speeches delivered. With scenes of families peacefully marching for housing relief, it will be harder for the government to dismiss the protests as extremist noise, neo-Nazi salutes, and chaos in the streets. It will be easier for ministers to push back against demands for cuts. Either way, the protests have already achieved one thing. They have made immigration impossible to ignore. The planning levels, whenever they are finally released, will not be judged as technical policy, but as a direct response to the protests and the anger behind them. In the end, the future of Australia's immigration program will be shaped by a collision of forces: economic necessity, political pressure, and public opinion. Protests on the 31st of August are not the sole driver of that collision, but they are a spark, a dramatic moment that crystallizes the tension. For those watching from abroad, wondering if Australia will remain an open destination, the message is clear. The debate is intensifying, and the outcome is uncertain. For Australians themselves, the question is deeper. Do they see immigration as a burden, straining their quality of life, or as a vital force, sustaining their prosperity? The answer to that question, far more than the protests themselves, will decide the numbers. So when the government finally announces the migration planning level for the year ahead, pay close attention, not just to the figure, but to the framing. Listen to the language. Watch how ministers justify the balance. Because hidden in those words will be the shadow of the protests, the weight of public anger, and the direction of Australia's future. Will the protests push Australia toward a smaller, more closed migration program? Or will the government resist the pressure, betting that the economic need for migrants outweighs the political cost? That is the suspense hanging over the nation today, and it will not be resolved until the planning level is revealed. Until then, Australia waits, caught between fear and necessity, between anger and pragmatism, between the demands of the street and the realities of the economy. The 31st of August may not decide the future of immigration on its own, but it will leave a mark that no government can ignore.